Hi everybody, welcome to the Open News meeting this week. I am Liz Moseley, I'm an editor here and I think most people know who I am. I've got a migraine, so sorry if I'm a bit lacklustre, but I've got a chamomile tea and a packet of pretzels and I feel like that is the classic prescription for a migraine. We're going to try and talk about a relatively migraine-inducing topic this evening, which is you can't put petrol in your car, you definitely can't have a turkey for your Christmas dinner, and we're trying to work out whether, or the extent to which this is a consequence of Brexit and or other factors, and what that might mean in terms of the sort of structural, I suppose, the tectonic plates of British politics, if we're looking at a moment of shift from where we have been for the last 4.5 years, something like that, since the referendum, or not, and to try and unpick that. I know that there are people watching at home. I hope that James is on at home. I think we've got quite a few tortoises who are going to make it back and come in through the door, so sorry if there's some opening and closing of the door as we go. Let me just ask the people in the room to begin with. Put your hand up if you've tried to buy petrol in the last 3 days. 4 days? Only 2 of you. Joe, I know you had a nightmare with a zip car on the way to Dorset.
My wife and I had decided to get away for the weekend, drag the kids off, and as we have abandoned our rather aged diesel, we have gone to Zip. So we got the Zip, picked it up. Oh, the last person had left it with virtually no petrol. Obviously, they'd had encountered the problem prior to us,
right,
of the queue for the local petrol station. So we started heading off, and at first sight of the local petrol stations, it was like, oh, we'll find one later. It's just a London thing. Got down through the dark for Blackwall Tunnel and off into South London, still kind of keeping an eye out for petrol stations, and eventually got to the point where the light started to flash, and it was like, right, we've got to bite the bullet. So we pulled in somewhere in Blackheath or something, to join a queue which ended up being at least 45 minutes before we were actually filled up, which we managed to get.
It's a weird feeling not being able to buy petrol.
Well,
I found it really sort of strangely upsetting because it's
normally so easy.
Yeah.
You just swing in and swing out.
And that's it. Who has not been able to buy something in a shop that they have gone in to try and find that they would normally be able to find in the last month or so? Tommy, what did you want and what couldn't you get?
Chicken thigh fillets in Aldi. But it was...
Poultry is a thing, though,
that was what I specifically went for, but it was like the whole chicken section was just...
decimated.
Yeah.
Lacto-free milk. Can't get it in London. Can get it in Bicester. So if you need to go...
Not far.
I'll maybe bring a barrel back for everybody. We're sort of laughing, but it's an odd feeling because we're all pampered pooches. We're used to just being able to live in a nice world where you can go and get what you want and what have you. When I was irate on yesterday morning when we were talking about this, partly because of the petrol situation, partly just because I cannot believe that this is the situation in which we find ourselves. Giles Whittell, who isn't here this evening, but he accused me of Waitrose wishful thinking when I ranted about it, which I'm still smarting for, so I'm shaming him for that in his absence. But Kerry, you said more intelligent things than I did about this. What are we trying to figure out this evening, basically?
I think we are trying to figure out whether or not this feels like a moment. So you can look back for analogies or similar moments. Chris Cook, when he used to work here, was always fond of pointing out that people of my age remember the sort of famous Winter of Discontent, 1978. And there's all these kind of legends of rubbish piling up in the street. Some people even talk of bodies piling up in the street. And Chris used to remind us that whole thing lasted like 3 days. So you can have short-term things that really lodge in people's minds. You can remember the 2000 when there were fuel shortages in sort of first term of Tony Blair's government, and that
Were
became
there?
yeah. So we
Fuel
had fuel shortages.
I don't remember
There was
that.
a tanker drivers' strike. It was a really big thing.
Right.
And for that first Labour government, that was a proper moment, a proper panic, and people did remember it for a while. Of course, they were re-elected the next year, so it didn't kill them politically. So I think we've got that question of whether does this feel like something that is going to sear itself into people's consciousness? Does the fact that the government was clearly hugely reluctant to relax the rules for visas, because there's been clamour for it from different sectors for a long time now. You talk to the CBI, I talk to them occasionally. This has been like a theme that they've been. This committee that's going to review labour shortages, is it meeting often enough? Why don't they just and the government waiting for the end of furlough in the hope that people will tip out of furlough and into jobs in hospitality or jobs in poultry or jobs in the supply chain. So it does feel like a moment for the government, because they really didn't want to relax the visa rules and they've been forced to. And I also think, is it a moment of political leadership as well? Because one of the striking differences between the 2000 fuel shortages and now is that Tony Blair was out front and centre in 2000, and unless I've missed him in the last few hours because I haven't been looking, we've yet to see Boris Johnson engaged in the problems over the last few days. So intrigued to think our way through what sort of political strategy is for that absence.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm hearing there's no crisis. I'm definitely hearing that. And we're also being told that there's lots of fuel in the country, so we should all just relax and wait for it to get there. And it's our fault for panic buying as well.
Look,
is
I
what
don't
I'm
take
hearing.
it as read that it was interesting. I was watching, Vox Pops often don't tell you a single thing, but there've been quite a number of Vox Pops on sort of national news and local news, where I have seen people blaming the media rather than, and that might just be self-flagellation in the people who are choosing the
In
Vox
what way?
Pops.
But blaming the media for reporting.
For whipping up this problem and causing the panic. So I think there's an open question about where the blame lands.
Interesting. Let's see if we can chat to James Harding, who's at home, I think. Are you there, James?
I am.
Hello.
Hello. I'd love to tell you I'm stranded. I'm watching Claire Fox smiling away at me. I am, but I'm nothing of the kind. I tell you what I think is that it is possible that this is, to Kerry's point, a moment, but not in the way in which some kind of Leavers and Remainers would want it to be. Either, I don't think it's the Leave moment where we reprice Labour and we deal with a long burning discontent around globalization, low wages, and the inequality of the modern economy. And I don't think it's the moment that many Remainers would want, which is the great big Ken Clarke, I told you so moment, and that Project Fear is Project Reality. I think it's a moment, though, where we're reminded that economics does matter more than culture in the conduct of our politics. And although you don't have a Labour Party, obviously, at the moment, that seems to know whether or not it wants more debt and taxes or less debt and taxes. It doesn't know exactly what kind of government and what kind of economic settlement it wants. The nature of the Conservative promise has for years been, we're economically competent, right? And if you get to a point where you're suddenly sitting around saying, okay, we have queues at petrol stations, we're back to 4% inflation and the worry of interest rate rises, and a curious situation where the Prime Minister is arguing for higher wages without necessarily really thinking through what would happen in a world where you get a wage ratchet on inflation, higher interest rates, and a knock-on impact on both the housing market and investment, right? all of these things really reopen economics as the battlefront of politics. And I think they reopen a big flank for the Conservatives. And the reason why you saw Boris Johnson fly back to a Tory right that is really worried, it's not about refighting 2016, it's about fighting the 2020s on a platform of economic competence. And that, I think, is reopened. So that makes it, I think, a moment.
Should we ask Claire Fox what she thinks?
Yes, let's do that.
Hi, Claire. Thanks so much for being with us. A speedy turnaround. It's lovely to see you. What do you make of all this? You've obviously, you're a pro-Brexit person. You've campaigned hard for it. What's your read on everything that James has just said on what's happening right now?
So I agree it's a moment, but I don't think it's definable quite straightforwardly in a Brexit Remain way. But if I can give you a Brexiteer's view of this, in 2016, after the vote was taken and we voted to leave, many of us who voted to leave assumed that one of the first things that the government and the civil service would do would be to look at the impact of leaving the European Union. And one of the impacts would be the end of freedom of movement. And in that context, we assumed that, for example, issues where there would be some pressure on jobs, such as where you have HGV drivers or care workers, would be looked at. And in fact, nothing happened in 2016 to indicate that we'd moved, because most of the people who run the establishment decided that even though we'd voted to leave, we weren't going to leave, and therefore they didn't have to do anything. So they didn't do anything. So if anything, I've been anticipating this moment for some time in terms of job shortages. I always knew this was going to happen. And so that's one thing to just bear in mind. It doesn't, this idea that some people are saying, oh, this proves that leaving the EU was a disaster and we knew all along, is actually, I'm sorry, and it's an indictment of the fact that, and I do agree with James on this, which is that the Conservative Party in its different guises, whether Theresa May and not even, but under Boris Johnson, he says Brexit will get done, have just not prepared, properly considered the economic issues in relation to skills shortages and so on and so forth. That's one thing. But I actually think it's a weird thing to sort of, I've been phoned by, I've agreed to do this, and I haven't agreed to do very many other things. I've been phoned by 3 or 4 different media outlets a day to say, does this prove Brexit's failed? Yeah. Right? And you just think, don't be tiresome. But I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. The reason why it's also a moment is, and why I do think somebody said in the chat, actually, more and more people are blaming the media for the panic. I'm not, by the way, but they are. That's quite widespread now. Yeah. But it's a moment because we've also been through the COVID period, right? And the lockdown period. We've had an intense time of fear mongering, understandable fear, but then kind of excessive fear in some instances. And now we have this kind of like end of days feel. Oh God, now we're running out of petrol. Everything's gone horribly wrong. So you've got to, I think you've got to take that into consideration. You've also got to look, it is true that the DVLA have made a complete mess of HGV licenses, by the way, and they are not working in the office, they're working from home, all sorts of problems. There's tens of thousands of people waiting to be registered, not getting sorted. So it's a bureaucratic nightmare there. So I think that the blame can be well and truly laid at the government's door, but to try and turn it into some sort of black and white, nah, Brexit thing doesn't work. And the more that, by the way, the leading Remain camp try and do that, it just consolidates what should not be a tit for tat moment. I just wanted to say another thing is, it's also a moment, by the way, because it coincides with COP26 coming up. And it coincides with an awful lot of people hectoring everybody about the fact that they shouldn't be driving their cars in the first place, that driving is bad. And I think it's a moment, as somebody who's not as eco-doom-mongering as some environmentalists, to say that a lot of people have suddenly thought, well, God, if this is what it means to be told that we can't drive and that you can't have access to petrol, if that's the future a la Extinction Rebellion, maybe we want to look at this again in terms of our priorities. And I think that is the kind of conversations that I'm hearing more, and the narrow way that people think it's going to be a big shift in terms of Brexit and Remain, I think is just wishful thinking by Remainers, I have to say. Brexit was always going to have an impact on skills shortages, and it's good that people are going to get higher wages. That's good. I don't think that our colleagues and fellow citizens in other European countries should ever have been seen as a source of cheap, exploitable labour myself. I always thought that was a rather degraded view of people who lived in East European countries in particular. But on the other hand, it was always going to have an impact, and nobody can deny that. There's no point leaving the European Union and going everything's going to stay the same. So of course it would have an impact, but it could have been planned for. 2016 was a long time ago. Mm. Right, I've got to get one thing I want to check is whether you're going to bring me in again, because I wanted to say something else, but I'll shut up now.
Oh yes, of course. Everybody gets lots of goes, and I haven't got anything intelligent to say. Kerry, what would you say to Claire back?
I think if you leave the politics aside and take your point, Claire, that this is a failure of planning, that's also part of Brexit, and that's part of the project. The project has been marked by dreadful planning since 2016. So I guess even though you might divorce some of what's happening now from or you can see that it could have been avoided, the fact that it hasn't been avoided still seems to me something that could have quite sharp and should have quite sharp political consequences, because it reflects choices that have been made, or reflects policies that have people like you have been warning should have been enacted and haven't for the last, for actually really quite a long time now.
Well, can I just say straight away, Kerry, what I was saying was that the people who run society refused to acknowledge that we had agreed to leave. And so it wasn't like that Brexit was a failure of planning. It was the refusal to accept that Brexit was a reality. Because if you actually look from 2016, for the next 3 years, we were basically, it was just assumed it would never happen. So, when you talk to people in senior civil service roles, they will say that they tried to say, what are we going to do? And that people said, look, it's not going to happen like that. So it's the attempt at overturning that democratic decision that I think has led to the lack of planning. Because
even if we let 2016 to 2019 go, you've still got time to improve conditions for HGV drivers, recognising
I agree.
And all of that. So you can't, we're not going to let the current government off the hook, are we? On
oh no. But I no, absolutely not. And that's why I said I also argued against the Boris Johnson's oversimplistic vote for me, we'll get Brexit done. It's all very simple. I mean, for me, it was a democratic decision, but of course it had consequences. And I would assume that the whole of the British establishment, left, right, all people in politics, accepting that democratic decision, would then work to make it work and to do whatever you needed to do. Yeah. But we are concentrating on this, and we are ignoring lockdown. I mean, I do think you can't just say that that's got nothing to do with it. If you look at what's happening in the care homes at the moment as well, there's all sorts of, which by the way is less fashionable to talk about, but just as dire as not being able to get your petrol, by the way, is the fact that there's not enough people to work in the care homes. But that's partly because of, for example, the mandatory vaccine issue. Yeah. Because of low wages, because of terrible conditions, and because what we've just been through in the last 18 months. So I'm just trying to say it's a bit more multi-layered, which I know that Tiltos does multi-layered, so you'll accept that. There's a bit more going on than reducing it to the one moment. That was what I was trying to say.
Yeah, but just so I understand where you're coming from, if in the last couple of years policy had been, all right, we can see we're going to be short of HGV drivers and care workers, and accepting that you don't think the Eastern European sort of low-cost labour is the solution in the end, we're still going to need to, create 100,000 visas so that those people can come in. Would you have been okay with that, or would you have regarded that as a problem?
So the issue around freedom of movement I'm not saying everybody thinks this, but the issue of freedom of movement for me was about being able to make decisions about, in a democratic sovereign sense, about what movement occurred in relation to borders, right? So I'm actually very liberal on immigration as it happens. That's not really the point. I've never convinced the majority of people in this country to be as liberal as maybe I would be. But democratically, you would make the decision that we control, rather than freedom of movement, not as an abstract concept, but as in an EU diktat, meant that you had no democratic choice about that at all, right? So that was the issue. I've got no objection to the visas issue. And one of the things that I think that is true is that a lot of people in the, not just in the Remain camp, I mean, a lot of people believe that Brexiteers are xenophobes who hate foreigners. And so they assume that there's no interest in having anybody from Europe or non-Europe working in this country. That was never the issue. Of course, there are xenophobes in this country, don't get me wrong, I know that. But I'm just saying that was not the majority view. It was to control borders, which is a different question. So for me, the issue might well be short-term visas, or even, you know, more than 3 months, 6 months, a year, you know, very technical, that conversation. But I genuinely mean this, that the skills deficit in this country is abysmal, right? And there are situations whereby lots of those jobs that were done by people who came here from other countries, they were exploited. They were given terrible working conditions and awful wages. And there is something wrong with the fact that we thought that was a good thing. And therefore, one of the things that I hoped for, as a bit of a lefty on the Brexit camp, was that Brexit would also shake up the labour market so that ordinary people would be recognised and given skills and given opportunities to earn a decent living, who were, yes, from the UK, but from any background, by the way, before anyone starts thinking I'm some sort of, you know, nativist or accusing me of that kind of approach. There's nothing to do with that. It was to do with saying corporations who want to exploit cheap labour from Europe in order to avoid paying decent wages and sorting out conditions shouldn't get away with it, and that we needed to address the skills deficit, which, as an educator from the past, somebody who taught in further education, I always thought was an important thing to want to do. And I've argued that in the House of Lords even more recently around the skills bill, that they should have been getting on with getting people skilled up to be HGV drivers without an awful lot of bureaucratic paperwork, by the way, that gets in the way.
Claire, can I ask you a question? Because it's James again, and sorry, Liz, just for jumping on this, but it's just there's a risk that I think we're playing a little bit too nicely here, right? And that if you were a Remainer, if you did vote to stay in the European Union, there is a reasonable argument today for saying, look, I'm really unhappy. When we went through this debate in 2016, every time there was a warning about labor shortages or food shortages or supply breakdowns, anything that you said of any of that kind was labeled Project Fear. It's now come to pass, and now it's either deemed to have been, a kind of failure of mismanagement in the implementation, or even worse, it's a good thing because it's shaking up the labor market. And just on top of that, people have reason to say, okay, well, now it turns out we have, quote unquote, our kind of democratic rights, our sovereign rights on free movement of people, except when it turns out that the labor market doesn't work. And then we make an emergency reach to open up a new visa exemption, and there may be a clutch of these to come. And by the way, we're still cross about the NHS bus, because it turns out that in order to fund what the NHS needs, we need a significant increase in taxation. And so overall, I'm not saying that this is a moment that reopens, Leave Remain, but you can understand why Remainers look at this and say, you completely rejected the arguments we made at the time as though they were Project Fear, that they weren't grounded in reality, that it was establishment offensiveness, and actually all the things that we feared have come to pass. And this is a perfect metaphor. And by the way, we've muted. Thank you very much for coming. Their end of the evening.
I think it's we get Claire to respond.
So the thing that I'm suggesting, I mean, I was talking more broadly about Brexit.
Yeah.
So I do not think that the crisis of HGV drivers and the fuel shortages are the consequence of Brexit before we
At
carry
all.
on, right?
At all, Claire?
Not mainly at the moment, but I'm trying to avoid saying, because it would be wrong to say that Brexit doesn't have a general impact on the way that the labour market will work. So I was kind of doing that long view. At the moment, what I can't get over that you're doing is 18 months, 19, 20 months now, isn't it, since lockdown started, right? A huge amounts happened. We've also, at the same time as we've been in lockdown, and before this shortages thing ever happened, we were planning, this is wait for my plug now, we were planning our Battle of Ideas Festival, which is happening on the 9th and 10th of October. 70 plus debates over a weekend, and we were doing a discussion, and you're all welcome, by the way, with views from all sides at Church House, 9th and 10th of October. Anyway, we were planning, what we were going to do about the skills issue. We were talking about it. There's a skills bill going through Parliament at the moment, and how we would approach that. And so we were not trying to then say that there was no impact of Brexit on that, but we were also looking at the impact of having locked down the economy and society for all that time, what impact it would have on all the different sectors. And actually, one of my cleverer colleagues very early on said it's going to have a terrible impact on drivers and HGV drivers, although lots of people are going to be getting jobs driving for Amazon and so on, because everybody was at home, and therefore they were leaving their HGV jobs and going to work, work for, where you don't have to go on long distance. A lot of people from Eastern Europe, and not just Eastern Europe, who are HGV drivers, went home because they wanted to be close to family, because we all thought we were going to die of COVID, if you remember. And then there was travel bans. So there was a range of different things that have happened, right? It's not just one right, thing. Claire, but you're saying, oh, can you understand why everyone's not mad? And I'm saying, I don't mind, but we're doing the Remain thing. What I'm saying is, how did this turn into the Brexit story when it's one of many stories? I don't mind people raising Brexit, but to have had listened to, which I have, over the last few weeks, that we always knew it was going to be terrible. You lot are to blame for this. Nothing else counts. Gina Miller's launching a new party. We're going to go back in the EU. You destroyed the country, as though nothing has happened else, is annoying. And I was just simply putting a counter view.
I get that, Claire, but I'm saying, well, I suppose what it's saying is there is clearly a moment in the political debate around this where these arguments of 2016 are returning. And part of the reason for that is people are looking across the channel at the European Union and saying, well, they're not having what's happening here. So there is a certain flexibility in those labour markets in response to emergence from lockdown that there's not in the UK, and they point to Brexit. And so the question I've got really is, if you're a Brexiteer and you're trying to make the case for Brexit now in this context, how do you do it when what seemed for a few years as though some of the kind of heat had sort of disappeared from the Brexit argument is clearly rising again?
I think it's rising. It's rising in one side. It's certainly rising in the media. People who voted Remain are very agitated and excited at the moment. But when you talk about flexibility of labour market, what I always said, and what many of us said, was that the EU did know exactly how to exploit workers. And when you talk about flexibility, I understand what you're talking about, and that's fine. That's a corporate view. It's a view that's very prevalent. It was a view that was espoused by the Remain establishment. I disagree with it. But when you talk about flexibility in general, after the last few years that we've had, or last couple of years that we've had, you will recognize that there was a lack of flexibility when it came to, for example, the production of the vaccine. If you remember, not that long ago, right? So we're going to do a tit for tat. By the way, I objected to people using the vaccine, the EU's inability to sort the vaccine situation out at the time. I didn't particularly like a kind of crowing about that, saying this is why Brexit works, because I personally think that crowing about things is unhelpful in general. But there are undoubtedly advantages to not being in the European Union. There are undoubtedly changes that happen when you're in the European Union if you're not. It's a political priorities. We're trying to kind of do we are now going through all of this because of Brexit without taking into account. I just made the point about the DVLA. The DVLA's inability to issue licenses for people at the moment as we speak, with something like a 34,000 backlog, right, is a bit like the backlog of cancer patients because of what happened with COVID. Now, we can blame Brexit for everything, but by and large, I think it's a bit more complicated. And that, by the way, that is exactly the same as the NHS issue that you mentioned about we have, you know, where's the money from the bus? You'd think we hadn't just been through what we've been through. God, the lockdown period has been a catastrophic, has had a catastrophic impact on all aspects of our society. That must be added to, not contradicting, but added to the impact of Brexit, I would have thought.
Can I?
Sorry, just bear with me a second. Thanks, Claire, and to James. I want to make sure I hear from some other people. We've got Joe and we've got Dave in the room, and there's lots of people in the chat. I'd like to hear from Yasmin, but I think she's in a library, so she's not allowed to talk. So we might have to deal with Yasmin just writing. But I'm interested to hear from a number of people in the chat as well. So let's go for Joe and Dave, and then we'll go back to people on screen. Go for it, Joe.
It feels to me more like we're experiencing or coming to the realization that Brexit wasn't a plan, it was just an ideology. And there was no plan, and there was no planning, and therefore all these foreseen disasters are very much coming to fruition. I think we're in danger of kind of getting drawn off onto just the petrol thing, which is a bit of a flash in the pan. But it's indicative of a huge Labour problem that we have because there was no plan to replace the flexibility of Labour that the European Union allowed us. There were lots of, pickers, pluckers, as well as drivers, as well as care workers who were coming in and out of the country on, lots of them served by students, working in coffee shops, studying here, and then returning 6-12 months later, having brushed up their English. And we're also feeling that when we queue for longer in the sandwich shop. So I think we're in danger of kind of getting hooked up on the petrol. But
Dave.
I suppose I think that we're entitled to expect accountability and competence at the top of government. And, Claire's point about an abysmal skills deficit seems to be writ large in cabinet, as far as I can see. And so far, we seem to have blamed a lot of people who aren't in charge. And we're not really talking about the people who are in charge. So, in short order, the media, Remainers, the DVLA, hectoring, doom-mongering, environmentalists, Extinction Rebellion. I think it's time we heard from Boris Johnson, and I think that to the question of is this a moment because it sticks to a government, you also could draw upon 1992 when the Tories had their nightmare day with the exchange rate mechanism, and anyone who had a mortgage saw interest rates go up and up and up in the same afternoon. And John Major standing there looking shell-shocked by it all. And even though they were 5 years away from an election, they never lost the stench of incompetence. And I think nobody who's lived through the pandemic and what we're seeing now and the ideology that's driving cabinet choices can surely consider that they would be voting for competence if they voted for Boris Johnson again.
Yeah. I'd like to come to Matt Zancona, who's at home or somewhere, because for those of you that were at the Thinking yesterday, we were talking about the arms race and vaccine distribution and things like that. And after the Thinking, actually, I was talking to Zav, our colleague Zav, about whether you can create a moment with a campaign, or whether a moment, a sort of zeitgeist moment, a wave that people catch, has to happen by itself. And I'm of the opinion, because I was born and raised in marketing, I know you can confect it. And Dad was like, no, you have to wait for people to decide on their own. And thank you to Andrew Girdwood for coining the word momenty. And is this a moment? It would be more momenty if it happens again. And my question to Matt D'Ancona is, hiya Matt. Oh, you're in the other room. Is that everything that's happened is an open goal for the opposition. And if I was clever and working with or in or around the Labour Party, bearing in mind what everybody said and what Claire has said as well, is that we knew this was going to happen. We knew we could see it coming. And I would be just looking at all the other things that are also coming and just saying those things again and again and again. It's petrol now, it's going to be turkeys and, you know, lacto-free milk. And then the next things will be this will happen here and this will happen here. And I wait for those things to happen and then just be like, but there's none of that. We've got leadership rule changes and trans rights rows, which just feels to me not the thing we need to be talking about to make this more momenty.
No, well, that's absolutely right. I mean, and you know, whether or not this is a moment, it's clearly not a moment that Keir Starmer is exploiting very effectively. I think it has the makings of a moment. I think it's harder to confect a moment than it used to be. I think that what's so interesting about it is that I wouldn't frame it in terms of Remain versus Brexit. I think that the core question here is, what do we expect out of a government? Because this government, the government that was elected in 2019 with a thumping majority, is not really a traditional Conservative government. I put in the chat the old Maurice Sarchi line that the Conservatives' brand was that they would be cruel. People wouldn't necessarily like them, but they would be competent. Boris Johnson is probably neither in people's perception. He's much more of a charisma engine. He's a symbolic figure. And what does he offer? He offers a kind of boosterism, where he can say with a straight face that we had a world-beating test and trace system, or preside over a government that claimed to be putting a protective ring about care homes, things that were demonstrably, empirically not the case. But what populist government do is they provide mood rather than a service. And attached to that boosterism is often a culture of attribution of blame. So it's absolutely in character that this is being blamed on the media. I mean, you know, straight out of the Trump playbook of fake news and so on. And quite often, and we reported on this at Tortoise, the use of culture wars as a kind of cordon sanitaire to keep public interest directed at cultural issues, some of them bogus, some of them real, so that attention isn't paid to issues of basic competence. Now, the problem is that that has a shelf life, because there comes a point at some moment when, if you're queuing 3 hours for petrol, if you're worried about food, if you read that there's an energy crisis, if you see that inflation is rising and you know that that will have implications for mortgages, if you are mindful of the environment and you read enough in the news to know that the mood about what COP is going to achieve is pretty dispiriting. If you're a real, obsessive, you note that Boris Johnson didn't turn up to the COVID summit last week that President Biden convened, and so on and so on. I mean, the list of incompetencies is not hard to draw up. At what point do you reach a critical mass where the populist bubble bursts? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we're starting to enter, as it were, the slip road where that question is going to be tested again and again. And I think Claire's right that the pandemic was such a singular period that it's very hard to draw snap conclusions about this. But I do think that the Johnson government is now entering a new phase of testing. Does its offer, which is essentially not to do with policies, but to do with mood, charisma, national spirit, is that enough anymore? And to return to your question, does Labour have any sort of alternative to offer?
Matt, I like the idea of being on the slip road in which we ask ourselves again and again when the populist bubble might burst. But even though Joe Biden won, it didn't burst in America, did it? As you said to me at lunchtime, 74 million people voted for President Trump. And that It's not a bubble bursting at all, is it?
If you earn your living as we do, trying to analyse things in a rational and sensible way, immersed in policy and the nuts and bolts of things, you have a natural inclination to think that the default position is towards rewarding competence, towards rewarding rational answers, towards finding out populist rhetoric and kind of saying to governments like Johnson's and Trump's, you're busting. But to me, the American election was a terrifying precedent, because although Biden won, 74 million people, in spite of everything, voted for Donald Trump, who is now relaunching himself as a candidate for the next presidential election. I don't know whether he'll be the Republican nominee. And it's rather off piece what we're talking about this evening. But all I'm saying is the assumption that populism will be found out is a dangerous one. And I think if Brexit has a lesson, it's that people, who move in quite rarefied circles in London have to be careful for making assumptions about where the pulse is.
Thanks, Matt. We'll go to Kira next in the room, and then I'd like to hear from Jacqueline Conway, who's watching at home. Hi, Kira.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. So I don't know much about the politics or everything, but I wanted to go back to some of the economics we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And especially some of the stuff Claire said about how a lot of the Brexiteers, they knew the effect that it would have on the economy, which I think a lot of people did, because it was one that you could predict. I mean, we have to be very real about the fact that this era we went through of low and stable inflation and low consumer prices was very much dependent on globalization. I mean, globalization was amazing for that. That's why it took off so much in the 1900s. And by leaving the EU, we're dialing back globalization, if not by much, at least by a little. And I think we have to be real about the fact that some of those brilliant benefits that were afforded to us will disappear. And this will probably mean rising consumer prices or inflation. And then timed along with this petrol shortage, fuel shortage, which is a textbook inflationary pressure.
Yeah.
We have to be real about that, but it doesn't have to be something, I think, that is, terrifying. Because as long as wages go up to match it, we don't have to see, hundreds of thousands of people pushed into food poverty. But I think, for me at least, the big question that I'm asking is, can we trust the government that we're living under to make sure that wages do go up to match? So a government that has raised national insurance and now is looking at, tapping recent grads for their student loan repayments. Can we say that to people now that are living on minimum wage, that they're going to see their wages rise to match the probably inevitable inflation? I don't know about that. Yeah, so that's the biggest worry for me. I think inflation isn't something, it's something that we should have seen coming with Brexit, and most people did.
Yeah.
But it's just about whether living standards will drop to match.
Accordingly. Yeah, it would seem like they will. Thanks, Kira. Let's hear from Jacqueline. Jacqueline Conway. Hi, Jacqueline. Hello.
Hi.
Made some comments in the chat. Do you work in care or in the NHS? I couldn't quite figure out.
I used to work in the NHS. Yeah, I used to be a doctor.
And are you making comments that you can already see that availability of labour for the NHS and care homes is much, much worse since we left the European Union? Is that the point you're making? Yeah. It's
dreadful. Apparently, the rate of new applications for nursing vacancies reduced by 97% in the month immediately after Brexit. And nursing shortages they're a nightmare. I'm not working anymore, but certainly when I last worked, the nursing shortages were a nightmare.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Jacqueline. I've mentioned before, actually, not for a while, but around about the time that we were doing the COVID inquiry, I can remember talking about a good friend of mine is a senior nurse in a big London hospital's ICU department. And she said, I'm trying to get the timing right. No, it would have been after we left the European Union, but it was in the middle of COVID. And she said that she had an absolute litany of instances where specific care errors had been made because they were understaffed or incorrectly staffed, because she was dependent on what do they call, like supply teacher but nurse equivalent thing. Yeah. Thank you. You look like you're about to jump again, Kerry.
Well, I haven't heard from Claire for a while, so I thought I'd re-engage her, and partly going back to what James was saying at the beginning. I think what kind of interested me about this conversation is whether actually the moment, I think as James really said, whether this is the moment when politics loses out to economics in the government's calculations. So, as we've discussed, the visa shortages that Claire and others have said, or the labour shortage that Claire and others have said were inevitable. The government chose not to listen to those for reasons that I think were largely political, and it's now been forced to listen to the economic reasons because they've overwhelmed their political arguments. And if that's the case, which seems to me probable, then that's actually quite a big change for this government, because it doesn't really have an economic project. It doesn't have certainly a traditional conservative economic project, and you can hear the tensions between number 10 and number 11 Downing Street when they try to thrash out in public what the economic project is. So I wanted to actually bring Claire back in and just try to have a think about what it does to politics if this is the moment when economic primacy is restored, in a way, I think, Claire, that you'd probably welcome, because you're arguing this from an economic standpoint.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm not, but economics, of course, can't be underestimated, but I don't think that economics should have primacy. I suppose that's one of the things. I think that we have to be careful about that, because somebody made the point in the discussion after I spoke, and they said, well, listening to Claire, I realized, well, Brexit always was an ideology, not a plan. And why wasn't it a plan? And I think that they're right in a way, which is that Brexit wasn't a technocratic plan. It was an argument about democracy and sovereignty. That's what I've tried to say. And the people who thought that it should be a kind of well-organized blueprint with a plan, and they couldn't understand why anyone would vote for this mad notion of sovereignty, then got a shock when they realized that that's what people were voting for. The thing about an ideological commitment to, for example, national sovereignty, doesn't mean then that you should have an incompetent government implementing those democratic wishes. So the difference between technocracy and people with ideas that inform politics is not that the people who've got ideas that inform politics should then be incompetent, but that the technocratic plan isn't the main driver. That's the point. And so a lot of people did say that they were prepared to risk losing their jobs when they voted to leave. They were prepared to risk all sorts of economic privations as threatened, and because they wanted something different. And it was the failure to understand that I think got the political elite and into a mess. They didn't anticipate it, and neither did the media. And I would be interested to vaguely know, well, you don't have to do a vote, how many people here voted leave, because 17.4 million people did vote leave, and they were the majority. And sometimes I'm in conversations similar to this where I just think, they don't reflect that broad split in society. I wanted to comment on populism, though, because I think this relates to the economic point. I was interested in what Matthew said, and particularly about the culture wars point. I mean, this is a different discussion, maybe in a different day, but one also has to be, I think one has to be careful about demonizing populism, because the word populism has become an insult against those popular decisions that were taken that, again, certain people didn't agree with. And I know Matthew and I've kind of entangled over that before. I'm not saying populism doesn't mean anything, but I'm nervous about this sort of attack on populism in some of the ways that it's used, because it does feel like an attack on democracy from grassroots. I also am concerned about the culture wars point, because I do actually genuinely think that the culture wars I wish it would go away, but it isn't, this idea that it's stoked up. And don't get me wrong, I hate the woke versus anti-woke, I hate all that. but there are genuine cultural rows going on that sometimes politicians should pay more attention to. And I do think the fact that the Labour Party have got themselves into this absolutely ridiculous situation whereby they will not define women as women and will not go into the, get themselves into this mess. I mean, maybe this will get me into trouble here, but I actually think the culture war over the trans issue in the Labour Party is far more damaging for it than people realise. And that's why they can't contain it. They want to say it's trivial and they don't want to talk about it and go away. Whereas actually practically every Labour organiser that I know who's a woman has left the Labour Party. Now, they might be in their 30s, 40s and 50s, and they might not be, so there might be a generational angle, but don't we think that's ridiculous? And the free speech stuff. And I think that when you try and have this conversation with some people, they say, oh, you're stirring up the culture wars. Whereas I don't find it difficult to define what a woman is. And I don't want to stir up the culture wars, but if we are going to be unable to speak, then I actually think that causes, I think that causes genuine concern. That then gets written off, by the way, as populism, stirring up the culture wars, and that I just think it misses the fact that there is a change, a massive change in the way politics is conducted, the debates that are banned, people being cancelled, and so on and so forth. So that doesn't answer anything, does it? It is a moment now. It is wrong to reduce it to a Brexit moment. There is a moment though, but it's not going to be a moment that the Conservatives will suffer for electorally, like because of the inadequacy of the opposition. They won't feel that, but I find more and more people who shifted from voting Labour to voting Tory to get Brexit done are in despair at the Boris Johnson Tory party, but they don't have anywhere else to go because they're definitely not going back to Labour. So they feel politically homeless. They, in the end, give Boris credit, but they do feel as though, and actually it's been more COVID than anything, they do feel as though there's a real problem with the government at present. And I think the queues and so on exemplify that, but it's not just straightforward an economic thing. It's more that they feel like they're not in control of the society, that they don't aren't honest or transparent about that.
Claire, can I ask a question? I'm really interested in what you said about, people leaving the Labour Party over the trans thing. Where are they going? Are they finding a new party, or are they just sort of thinking, oh God?
No, that's what I was saying. Was I think people feel politically homeless.
Right.
It's not as though look, radical feminists and feminist academics. People who ran the miners' wives groups that I used to be mates with, those kind of people who are leaving, right? They aren't going, oh, I must go and join the local Conservative Party. Yeah. They're certainly not going to get, I mean, some of them, by the way, might join the Green Party, but in view of the fact the Green Party is wrought with difficulties over the trans issue, and the same with the Lib Dems, there's hardly anywhere to go. So they're politically homeless. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know how this will play out electorally. But I do feel as though there's a febrile atmosphere of disillusion with mainstream political parties that as yet is all over the place. And I was just making that point that the trans issue for me sums it up because of the confusion around it, because a lot of the feminist movement now feel completely abandoned. I mean, Joan Smith and I don't necessarily agree on very much or get on, and she'd probably be the first to say it, but I'm defending her. She'd appreciate, we've all been lumped together by accident. We didn't mean to do that. And even if it's only just that the ability to talk about these issues has been challenged.
Yeah, I think that's super fascinating, probably thinking for another day.
I'm putting it Tessa.
Tessa's had a little yellow hand up for ages, Tessa. We will unmute you so you may speak.
So Liz, I'm afraid that I'm slightly bubbling up here.
Bubble away, you've got...
We've got a deficit, we've got shortages, we've got labour issues, we've got the universal credit being reduced, we've got inflation, we've got people's fuel suppliers going out of business. You know, the list goes on. It goes on. And I'm sorry, but 10 minutes on the trans culture war is not the issue here. The issue here is we have absolutely no accountability, and we have had a government that sort of led us into this situation and is supposed to lead us out. But I don't think there's a single shred of confidence that they will. And we're all kind of scratching our heads at what point will the penny drop? And is it going to be this winter when furlough comes off and when businesses stop being quite so nice to everyone because we've been going through COVID and cost base start getting slashed and job numbers, you know, job loss numbers start going up and the cost of living starts going up and Christmas is screwed over again? You know, when are we actually going to get a little bit angry? I feel like there's been some sort of low grade sedation being put into the water supply. This is unbelievable what we're going through at the moment as a country, with a total vacuum of leadership and competence. You know, we're focusing on the frigging dead cats that are being bounced all over the place in this conversation tonight. This is not what we should, this is time to get angry about this. This is time for serious accountability. You know, at home and abroad, we got incensed last night about our ability to commit to a really important commitment to deliver vaccines around the world, which is both a moral obligation, but also a self-interested one to protect this country and further economic damage from variants putting us back into square one. And I just wonder when we are going to get angry about this.
Well, it seems like you've got angry now, Tessa. So
really? I thought I held it back quite well, Liz.
James Harding, what are we doing at the end of this Open News meeting?
That's really not fair. So we are, well, firstly, we're going to Claire's battle of ideas, not least to have a further battle of ideas. I do think, Claire, there is an issue, Claire, which is there's a kind of the thing for Brexiteers, which is sort of whataboutery. Oh no, we're going to talk about other things. Or, by the way, you know what, there are problems here with implementation, etc. I personally think that we are heading into a really tough and angrier winter in terms of our politics, because we're getting back to what really matters in terms of like jobs, cost of living, fairness, and I think that the reason I try to frame it at the beginning by saying, look, it's not necessarily a moment in which we return to the arguments of 2016, but it certainly might be a moment where we turn to the tenor of 2016, where it feels as though things are much more confrontational. The fact that the left is so split still, not just on Brexit, but on economic management, and the fact that there's clearly a gap in terms of, you know, public enthusiasm for Starmer versus Johnson, might disguise that, but it's not going to disguise what people are feeling. So I think that this question, for me, I think as Tortoise, I think our job is very different from the battle of ideas or from the kind of Fleet Street papers, which is to take sides. I think our job is to try and say, okay, what is the truth of what's happening in inflation, interest rates, and the cost of living? What is the truth of what's happening in terms of, you know, jobs, immigration, the labour market? And actually, I'm afraid, what is the truth of what's happening in terms of our public services and the funding that's needed? I think there is a big problem here. Tessa talked about accountability. I still think there's an issue about truth.
Kerry?
Yeah, Kerry. And by the way, Kerry's got the answer to this.
I can rather cheekily bring it back to my initial story of my journey away for the weekend. If Boris Johnson had been driving the car, the warning lights would have been flashing, and he would have just been telling everyone that it was all fine, and he'd end up on the hard shoulder with no fuel left. Sadly, if Keir Starmer had been driving the car, he'd still be arguing with the kids in the back seat. So maybe it's about time that the rest of us
get out on the streets.
Get out.
There was a really good suggestion in the chat. I think it was Andrew Girdwood, that I think is something that we practically could have a crack at Tortoise. You know, what I was saying before, which is if I was clever and in the Labour Party, I'd be looking for the things that are going to go wrong next, just to maintain momentum. You know, if we say that Zav is right and you can't confect a moment, what you can definitely do is you know, help to maintain momentum behind something. I don't look angry because I've got a migraine, but I am absolutely fuming, and that was why I was so cross in the editorial meeting yesterday morning when Giles accused me of Waitrose wishful thinking. And my feeling is I think we can. I think we have enough chops, I think was the word that Andrew used, and certainly with the conversations that we have every week with the CBI, I think we will know what are the things that are going to hit people hardest next. I think we will be able to define quite clearly what Christmas is going to be like, because that is the only way that people are going to care. They care if they haven't got pigs in blankets, they care if they haven't got petrol in their car. I'm afraid they don't care about any of the other humanity stuff. But I think let's have a look at that and see what are the next home comforts that are going to go down as a consequence of whatever the consequence, whatever it is, whether it's Brexit or whether it's government incompetence. It doesn't actually matter. If this is the beginning of a moment, then let's do everything we can to keep the wind behind it, ideally without having to get out on the streets. But if we have to get out on the streets, then we'll do that too. Thank you very much to everybody for bearing with us. Thank you to everybody for coming into the newsroom. Hope you've enjoyed your glass of wine. Lola's been nursing a full glass of wine all the way through. We're back tomorrow evening here in the newsroom, actually, with Ed Ball. So if you want to come down and see him, that would be great. And then Thursday's the Cyber Summit and Caitlin ran in the evening. So we'll see you all then. Thank you very much. Good evening.